Hello, and thank you for joining this session. Today, we'll be having a deep dive into the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, also known as TCFD. This presentation forms part of the ICRS COP26 Learning Zone. I am joined by Laura Jordan, Associate Director at Avieco, who is kindly giving up her time to share her expertise on the topic of TCFD. This will cover a range of insights such as what is TCFD and why is it implemented, who needs to report, and where do organisations start on their TCFD implementation journey? Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Stephanie. So today I'm going to talk through the TCFD, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So why the TCFD? Don't we already have enough? So you may have heard this term of alphabet soup of ESG frameworks. There seems to be an ever-increasing raft of kind of regulations and acronyms to describe companies' performance in ESG and how they rate themselves. But the problem is there isn't much sort of configuration between them. They're not coming together. And one important thing that companies are looking at the moment is climate. So how does climate affect them, and how will they affect the climate going forward? Why climate? Why is that what the TCFD is focusing on? It was highlighted here by the World Economic Forum for their Global Risk Assessment for 2021, which was released at the end of 2020. They saw climate action failure as the second highest risk that the world would face in the coming years, closely behind infectious diseases following on from COVID-19. So that just highlights how important climate action failure is for the whole world economy. So what does climate risk mean? It means different things to different companies. The most visible effects that you're likely to see are physical climate risks, so macroeconomic shocks caused by changing weather patterns, extreme events, wildfires, rising sea temperatures, and thinking how that will affect your business. There's also the unanticipated financial losses as well, through supply chain disruptions, flooding, those one-off events that are 1 in 100-year events that are quickly becoming more and more regular that we see through the economy. But crucially, a lot of the financial impact is driven by transition risks. So this is the transition required to become a low-carbon economy. This will affect the economy in many different ways through abrupt economic adjustment, such as rapid losses in the value of assets, changing policies, changing consumer preferences, a lack of preparedness for the transition. Many governments around the world are moving towards legislative pressure towards carbon reduction and net zero targets. As companies move to reduce their carbon impact and their carbon footprint, they will have to change the way they do business. This will change the markets in which they operate and how they drive their companies. Finally, climate-related risk can cause stranded asset risk. Those assets which are biggest in your portfolio, which has given you the biggest returns, are now longer at risk and can no longer be financed, are no longer relevant to your business. This is all called transition risk, and this also needs to be covered when you're considering the risk of climate change. And then how do we think about climate change? So importantly, the impacts that you will see for climate change will differ greatly by the level of climate change that we feel around the world. You may have seen these figures around the 1.5 degrees of change, the 2 degrees of change, or the 3+ degrees of warming. These are all driven by the level of greenhouse gas emissions throughout the world. And so consequently, what we anticipate the level of global warming will be around the world. At 1.5 degrees, which is where the world is now aiming for, it is hoped that major impacts can be avoided as long as global warming is kept to this level. But while it is not risk-free, it's our likely best possible outcome at this point. But even under this scenario, the global GDP loss would still be up to 0.5% within 100 years. At 2 degrees of warming, the climate impacts could potentially be catastrophic. Sea level rises, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. Extreme adaptation will be needed to adjust to a world with 2 degrees of warming. At 3 degrees or 3 degrees plus of warming, severe climate impacts will impact the whole planet. There will be losses in the global economy, and we would lose roughly 1/3 of our GDP. It may sound as scaremongering, but the world will be a very different place under 3 degrees of warming. So what do companies need to do? So the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, is promoting high-quality climate-related financial disclosures. It's making companies dig into all different areas of their business and their reporting and their strategy to really understand the impacts of climate change on their company and disclose not only how they're measuring it and monitoring it, but how they are responding to it going forward. So the TCFD was promoted by the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, to improve climate-related financial disclosures. So as I'll show in my next slide, in later slides, this is being rolled out across the UK. It's also being adopted by a lot of the developed nations to respond to TCFD, so that climate-related filings and climate-related impacts can be compared across different parts of the economy and different parts of the globe. Currently, it's a voluntary framework. As I mentioned, it's being rolled out across the whole of the UK, and many of the other nations, including the US, are anticipated to roll this out shortly. It's supported by over 1,000 companies with over $1 trillion in market cap. This was a few months ago, so the support for TCFD is growing. But most importantly, it enables climate businesses to prepare for climate-related disruption. It helps them understand how climate change will show up in their business and what they can do to respond to it and change their strategies. So the TCFD itself is split into 4 pillars, split under governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The metrics and targets, which is central to the TCFD, looks at how you're measuring and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. It's looking at your scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint, but also what targets you set yourself within the business, how senior executives are incentivized through metrics and targets, what targets have you set yourself for carbon reduction, how are you taking advantage of the climate-related opportunities that you identified. Risk management, how is your risk management framework integrating these metrics and these targets that you set yourself? But more importantly, how are you finding climate change when it turns up in your business, and how are you integrating that into your existing risk management framework? Strategy, what is the impacts of climate change on your strategic and financial planning? Often the effects of climate change are being felt over decadal cycles, very different to clients' existing strategic planning cycles, which can be a few years. And how do you marry the two, the long-term effects of climate change with the very short-term planning cycles of companies? Finally, governance. How is this managed within your business? How do board have oversight? How do management have oversight of the climate risks? So delving into the exact recommendations of the TCFD. So these are currently the 11 specific disclosures that you're required to describe to evidence your climate action. You'll see out of the 11 of them, all of them start with either describe or disclose. So under your first TCFD disclosure, it's very much a descriptive process of describing these actions within your business, describing how they turn up within your business, and disclosing how you're measuring and targeting this within your business. So to run through them, governance, as I mentioned, is looking at the board's oversight and the management's role in assessing climate change. Which committees is climate change being discussed by? Which committees is it on the agenda of? How does management become aware of climate-related risks and opportunities? How are they incentivized to change the business sufficiently to be resilient to these? Strategy. This can often be the hardest pillar to address. The key to this is identifying your climate-related risks and opportunities over different time horizons, so short, medium, and long term. As I mentioned, the planning horizon for clients can be very different to their existing planning cycles. How do they marry the long-term effects of climate change with their traditional cycles and their strategy? But once you've identified those risks and opportunities, what is the impact of those on your strategy and financial planning? Importantly, looking at the impact of those under different temperature scenarios. TCFD asks you to describe your impact of these risks and opportunities under at least 2 different temperature scenarios. As I mentioned earlier, we've got the ones most commonly used are either 1.5, 2 degrees or 3 degrees of warming. Can you really say what your business will look like under 2 different temperature scenarios within 10 years? To do this, you use climate-related scenario analysis. looking at different quantitative and qualitative versions of the future to understand how your market will change, how the way in which you operate will have to be flexed to meet the changing requirements of the future economy. And lastly, because this is looking at your strategy, how resilient are you to those different scenarios? Once you've noticed a change in your environment, part of your market dropping away, a new part of your market appearing, how do you respond to that? What business changes will you have to make now and in the future? How will your workforce change? How will your operations change? How will your marketplace change? How material are they to your existing business and your future plans? Moving on to the risk management pillar, describing your process for identifying these risks and then managing these climate-related risks. Quite often, companies' risk management systems only look at existing risks. Some of these climate-related risks are unforeseen legislative changes, sea level rises, long-term changes in weather patterns, long-term changes in supply chains, increasing carbon cost. How will this affect your business, and how will it eventuate in how you deal with your end customer? You need to ensure that these emerging risks are identified through your existing risk management system, and you have systems to pick these up and integrate these into your overall risk management framework. Finally, the metrics and targets. Disclosing the metrics that you use to measure your impact on climate-related risks and opportunities in line with your strategy and risk management process. Are you looking at the opportunities available and how you capitalise them? Are you looking at the kind of risks and how you mitigate them? Also, your greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon accounting is an increasingly important part of looking at your adaptation to climate change. Are you just measuring your scope 1 and 2, which is where a lot of companies start? Are you looking at your scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 is, for many companies, the largest part of their carbon footprint. Understanding how your scope 3 emissions come about and how you can influence that and change it and ultimately reduce it is a large part of the metrics and targets of TCFD, explaining how your company will adapt to climate change. Finally, the targets used by the organisation. There's a growing raft of net zero and carbon reduction targets throughout all areas of the economy. Companies are looking and stakeholders are looking whether those targets are enough, whether companies are doing enough to reduce their impact on climate change and do good. These targets help demonstrate that you've got measurable, quantifiable targets that you're aiming for and hopefully reaching to limit your impact on the climate. As TCFD is being rolled out, the requirements are changing all the time. So those 11 disclosures on the prior page were the initial TCFD recommendations. There are additional requirements for these 8 areas of the economy. In addition, in July this year, 5 additional supplemental guidance were released for companies within the financial segment, so within insurance companies, asset owners, asset managers and banks, and highlighting a few here. So within the strategy section, insurers should now describe significant concentrations of exposure to carbon-related assets. So there's questions around which of your assets are carbon-related, how you classify those, and what concentrations you have to those. How do you measure your exposure to those parts of the industry? What is significant in terms of your portfolio? Within banks, a large part for banks is the metrics and targets is the measurement. So the measurement of their scope 1, scope 2, and crucially their scope 3. So banks measure their emissions through the PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials methodology. So there are lots of sort of industry norms, the WACC becoming one of them, the weighted average carbon intensity, where you need this to look at your total portfolio to understand the carbon impact of your financed emissions and how that will change over the time over your stated metrics and targets as you're responding to climate change. So as TCFD evolves over the next few years, we anticipate there being additional supplemental guidance for other areas within the industry, really delving deeper than the previous 11 requirements to talk high level about disclosure and describe, really getting into the detail of what you need to understand within your portfolio and its impact on the environment. So when do you need to do this by? There's quite a lot to do for companies who haven't looked at TCFD before. It can be hard knowing when to start. So the UK Treasury has published a roadmap for compliance across the next 5 years, and it's anticipated a large part of the UK economy will have to disclose under TCFD. So under this timeline for 2021, so the first cabs off the rank are the largest occupational pension schemes, banks, building societies, insurance companies, and premium listed companies. We're currently working with clients in all of these sectors to produce their first TCFD disclosures. Next year, larger numbers of UK companies will come under scope for reporting under TCFD, and the FCA, BEIS, and the Department for Work and Pensions are currently updating their guidance for 2022 for these companies who fall within the 2022 disclosure regime, to provide kind of further supplemental guidance to exactly what they will have to disclose in 2022 when it's their first year to disclose. Rolling out to 2023, 24 and 25, UK Treasury and these advisory bodies have not yet decided exactly who will fall into these buckets and exactly what they will have to disclose. Those will be developed over the next couple of years as the first companies are disclosing their TCFD requirements. But what is sure is that more requirements will come and they will become more prescriptive in what you have to disclose. Therefore, disclosing earlier, disclosing sooner, approaching TCFD now enables you to understand the first iterations of it before the guidance becomes more prescriptive and there's less room to move as the requirements become more exact. So where do you start with this? How do you do your first TCFD disclosure? So here we've shown the 5-step approach that Avieco takes to disclose under TCFD. So the first step is prepare. So this is look at your existing disclosures and provide an action measurement where you are, where your competitors are, what regulation is saying, and what you can do next. Quite often some companies already have some action in regards to kind of climate change and climate action that just needs to be brought together for their first disclosure. Some companies have a way to go to evidence kind of how they're looking at the impact of climate change within their organisation. So the first step is really this gap analysis to really find out where you are, what you need to disclose, and what your gaps are. From there, we at Avieco take our clients through a process to sort of longer term compliance. Compliance with TCFD is never meant to be a 1-year process. It's an ongoing process, but it can take between up to 3 years to get a good first year disclosure, especially in terms of the measurements and the climate scenario analysis to kind of really understand where your business is up to. So once you've gone through the initial gap analysis, the next step is to ensure climate change is embedded within your governance. Governance is how you run your company. It's how everything stays on track. You secure support for the TCFD at the most senior level within your company and kind of integrate climate change into your governance processes. That ensures you're on the right track to start with. From there, it's analyse. It's looking at these key risks and opportunities and the financial quantification and qualification of those. This is the climate scenario analysis piece where you look at the financial impacts under different climate scenarios. You build out different scenarios of the future world in which your company operates and looked at how you respond to those and how that needs to impact your strategy and financial planning. The next step is responding. Once you've identified your risks and opportunities, what will your company do about them? How do you mitigate those and how do you monitor the risks? How do you monitor for existing risks and emerging risks and changing risks? How will you measure those? This really needs embedding the climate risks and opportunities into your risk management framework, ensuring that they're captured going forward. From there, you can develop your metrics and targets for performance and monitoring, looking towards your competitors and looking towards the market to ensure you're keeping up with where regulation and your stakeholders require you to be. The fifth part is disclosure, so ongoing communication to all your stakeholders as to kind of how you're responding to climate change and how you will respond going forward. Response to climate change is never a one-off process, it's an ongoing roadmap. We continually revisit our roadmap with our clients to look at how they're responding to climate change. How you respond in the first year will evolve as you identify more risks and opportunities, as your understanding of them grows and your understanding of how the market changes will grow. Also, climate science is changing all the time as well. There are new predictions coming out constantly as to kind of what the future may look like for climate science. and you need to look at how your company responds to those going forward. So a short piece of information about Avieco. So we're a sustainability consultancy. Since 2007, we've been working with a broad range of organisations, from global corporates to SMEs. We cover carbon reporting, water, waste, responsible supply chain logistics, packaging, sustainable strategy, offsetting, regulatory standard and compliance, and many more. We have an impressive list of clients who we're proud to have worked with for a long time. Thanks, Stephanie. I hope you found that useful, and that's useful for the Hub as an introduction to TCFD.
Thank you so much for your time, Laura. That was so useful and a great insight into TCFD as well. I had one short question, just in terms of, so when companies are disclosing, obviously there is alignment with other disclosures such as CDP as well. Where do companies, from your experience, tend to disclose kind of TCFD? I've seen it in annual reports, or is it kind of standalone reports? What is best practice within the industry?
It's really evolving. So you're right, some companies do it within their annual reports. They do a standalone TCFD report. They do environmental reports, sustainability reports, or a TCFD index is something we see all the time. It really varies from company to company and industry to industry, kind of where you are on your climate journey and what you want to disclose. It would really be a question of what makes sense to you most and what makes sense to your stakeholders. Importantly, many stakeholders and investors are looking for this climate information. So we often find that kind of bringing it together as one standalone report makes it very clear kind of what your strategy is and how you're responding to climate change. And we do find with feedback from clients and stakeholders that a standalone report can be a very strong response to this. In terms of kind of tying into other frameworks, you're right, there is a very strong alignment between TCFD and CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, the annual questionnaire that many companies do. And that really does help with your first response to TCFD as well. If you're a strong respondent to CDP, a lot of that around the implementation, the metrics and targets can help inform your first TCFD response as well.
Great. No, that's really useful. Thank you so much for the overview. It's really appreciated.
No problem. Thanks, Stephanie.